My grandmother was German. When I was a kid and would come over for the weekends, she would always share these fascinating stories that I would listen to with wide eyes and a curious mind. We went through the usual stories that kids know: Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, and Rapunzel. When we'd exhausted almost every tale that the Grimm brothers wrote, I'd grown up a little. I was now in my early teens and still spent time with her. Handing me a plate full of freshly baked cookies and a large glass of milk, she would always smile and chuckle at my innocence. I looked at the portrait of her and my grandfather for the 5th time on the refrigerator. It was black and white, suggesting that it was taken long before my time, but it was still good quality. My grandmother looked beautiful in her wedding dress, and my grandfather radiant in his suit. Both of them were turned towards each other, a big smile on both of their faces. The scenery behind them was equally breathtaking, a backdrop of endless trees and brush. I tilted my head as I took another bite, examining the photograph even more closely. "Hey, Grandma?" I asked, a little perplexed at what I'd discovered. "Yes, dear?" she replied sweetly, swaying lazily back and forth in her rocker. "Who's the man behind Grandpa?" I asked. "What do you mean?" Wiping my mouth on the sleeve of my sweatshirt and patting my hands on my jeans, I retrieved the photo from the fridge and walked over to her. I pointed at the backdrop. "Do you see him?" I asked, scooting closer. My grandma gently took the picture away, and then looked it over with tired old eyes. Once she realized what I was talking about, she smiled and handed it back to me. "Yes, I do," she replied, while leaning back in her chair and closing her eyes. "Yes, I do." Fast forward a couple years later, and I'm the only one left. Well, the only one who still sees her anyways. She began to talk about seeing things that weren't there, over and over. Mom and Dad decided that it was best to put her in a home. Despite what the doctor said about her mind slipping away, I still believed my grandmother. She would talk non-stop about stories from her youth, when she lived in Germany, and how she met my grandfather, and how he died. She said a tall man in a black suit had taken her husband, and now it was after her. I felt my stomach knot at her words. A cold sweat began to envelop my body as my knuckles turned a ghastly white. She looked at me, and then chuckled. "It is not your time," Grandma said softly. "He only comes for me." What the hell was she talking about? Had she completely lost it? Smiling falsely, I excused myself to go to the bathroom. It was there, over the sink. A wretched sob ripped from my chest and violently shook my body. I sank down onto the floor and cradled my face in my hands. Grandma. Her mind was now completely gone. Gathering myself together, I splashed cold water onto my face and then proceeded back into her room. The lights flickered for a brief moment and then continued burning brightly. Sniffling, I turned the metal knob to my grandma's room and then entered. As I looked back up, I stopped in my tracks. A child replaced my grandmother. She bounced on the bed happily, giggling with delight, while an ominous figure lurked in the corner. He simply sat as still as a statue. His back was completely erect, and with stoicism watched the child and her antics. He folded his arms in his lap, and then slowly turned to look at me. I suddenly felt lightheaded. I tried to run and scream, but that didn't work. I was frozen to my spot in my throat. I'd become irritably dry, my knuckles seared white as I squeezed the hell out of the knob for support. The man with the missing facial features turned back to the child. His long, pale fingers rested under his chin in boredom. Or, perhaps, like a parent waiting for their kid to finish. I could not take my eyes off of his hands. They were deathly white, elongated, spidery fingers that had finely sharpened fingernails. I was frightened. Soon my breaths came in short gasps as I began to hyperventilate. The creature noticed this. Without taking an eye off of the bouncing kid, one of his arms stretched all the way across the room and reached me. It snaked onto my right arm, and then gently pried open my fingers from the knob. My arms fell limply to my side. Tingling. The door shut behind us. The child giggled.
"I think you're scaring her," she said. "A gentleman should always be polite in the presence of a lady."
An unmistakable sigh. The creature dipped his head. The child smiled.
"It's all right. We'll be gone soon anyways."
It hit me. Suddenly, she looked so familiar. I gasped. Gran? The child giggled again, answering my question. My mouth opened slightly in shock. The tall creature glided gracefully over to her and offered her his hand. I shook my head immediately. Don't go, I rasped, my throat still affected by an unknown ailment. My grandmother smiled.
"We have to. Don't be sad. We'll see each other again."
Tears rolled down my face. I was helpless to stop this thing, whatever the hell it was. I rubbed the waterworks away with my hand. The faceless man walked over to me, and as if to give me his condolences, he smoothly reached into his suit and pulled out a card. He gently grasped my wrist and turned my palm upwards. He then placed the small business card in my hand, and then let his linger over mine for a moment. I averted my eyes so I wouldn't have to look at his face. With another heavy sigh, the creature gently ran his fingers through my hair, and then withdrew to the window. My grandma only coming up to his kneecaps. With a sad smile, she let the tall figure hold her hand. "Goodbye," she whispered sweetly. And then they were gone. Choking down the sobs that threatened to bubble up, I shakily turned the card over. I could not stop the tears as they soaked the circle with an X.